Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're looking at cardiovascular disease evaluation, but we're going to treat it like exactly what it is, a high-stakes detective investigation. You see, when a patient presents with symptoms, a physician essentially has to become an investigator, piecing together subtle clues to solve a complex, often life-threatening mystery.
So it all starts with one massive question. How do doctors actually diagnose the deadliest category of disease on Earth? To figure this out, we're drawing directly from Chapter 243 of Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine. Now, for cardiologists and internal medicine docs, this isn't just some heavy textbook gathering dust on a shelf. It's literally the guidebook for solving life-or-death mysteries, and it provides a really rigorous, systematic framework for clinical evaluation.
Okay, let's dive into this. Our investigation breaks down into 5 key phases: the cardiovascular disease crisis, the 4 elements of cardiac diagnosis, the NYFHA functional classification, the heart murmur algorithm, and finally, avoiding common clinical pitfalls.
Starting with Phase 1, the cardiovascular disease crisis.
To truly grasp the stakes here, we have to look at the sheer magnitude of the problem we're up against. Cardiovascular diseases are incredibly prevalent, diagnosed in almost half of the adult population in industrialized nations. But this number right here, 19 million, is the one that really sets the stage. That's the estimated number of global deaths caused by cardiovascular disease every single year. It is the #1 leading cause of death for both men and women. That staggering figure proves exactly why mastering the diagnostic blueprint we're about to explore is so absolutely crucial.
Moving on to Phase 2, the 4 elements of cardiac diagnosis. When you're fighting a crisis of this scale, doctors need a bulletproof system. According to the New York Heart Association, or NYHA, a complete cardiac diagnosis isn't just slapping a single label on a patient. It actually requires the systematic consideration of 4 distinct pillars. First, what's the underlying etiology? Like, is the root cause congenital, or hypertensive, or ischemic? Second, the anatomic abnormalities. Which exact chambers or valves are physically damaged, hypertrophied, or dilated? Third, physiologic disturbances. How is the system actually malfunctioning? Like, is there an arrhythmia? And fourth, functional disability. What is the actual physical impairment the patient is experiencing day to day?
And this brilliantly illustrates why you absolutely need all 4 of those elements. As the text spells out, if a patient comes in with chest pain, just saying, "Oh, it's myocardial ischemia," is only step 1. It's totally insufficient for putting together a life-saving treatment plan. A doctor has to dig deeper and find the underlying anatomical problem causing that ischemia, like coronary atherosclerosis, and then check if something else, like severe anemia, is making it worse. You literally cannot treat the patient effectively without the whole picture.
Phase 3. The NYHA functional classification.
So now that we have our diagnostic pillars, think of this next part as the clinical threat assessment. This is the famous NYHA functional classification matrix, and notice how the symptoms dangerously escalate row by row. In Class I, you've got no limitation. Ordinary physical activity doesn't cause any undue fatigue or shortness of breath. But hit Class II, and there's a slight limitation. Ordinary activity starts causing symptoms. Class 3, marked limitation, where even less than ordinary activity triggers issues. And then Class 4 is the most severe. That's the inability to carry out any physical activity without discomfort, with symptoms popping up even when the patient is resting perfectly still.
But here's what's really fascinating about assessing that functional impairment. It's highly relative. A doctor can't just jot down that a patient complains of being out of breath. Getting winded after 2 flights of stairs, known as 2-flight dyspnea, means something drastically different depending on who you are. For a highly conditioned marathon runner, 2-flight dyspnea is a massive red flag. It points to a much graver clinical threat and a steep functional decline. But for someone who's always been pretty sedentary, not quite as alarming. Context is literally everything in the clinical history.
Phase 4, the heart murmur algorithm.
All right, once the history is taken, the medical detective moves to the physical exam, which is essentially their primary interrogation technique. Think about the anatomical cross-sections of the heart. The sounds a doctor picks up through a stethoscope are directly linked to the structural integrity of those internal chambers and valves. So, if a valve is too narrow, which is stenosis, or if it doesn't close right and blood leaks backward, known as regurgitation, it disrupts the smooth flow of blood. That structural issue creates turbulence, and that turbulence is exactly what doctors are hearing when they detect a heart murmur.
So if the investigator hears that turbulence, what is the very first branch of the decision-making tree in the Harrison's algorithm? Well, they have to ask, Is this murmur systolic or is it diastolic?
So the crucial point is that this one single distinction completely changes the clinical pathway. Soft, grade 1 or 2 mid-systolic murmurs in young adults who feel totally fine are actually incredibly common. They're usually benign and generally require zero further workup. But contrast that with a loud systolic murmur, grade 3 or higher, or absolutely any diastolic murmur. The text makes it clear. Diastolic murmurs almost always mean structural heart disease. Because of that, they immediately trigger further investigation, usually an echocardiogram, to visualize exactly what's going on in there.
And finally, Phase 5, avoiding common clinical pitfalls.
Look, even with the best algorithms in the world, medical investigations can go off the rails, so we really have to recognize our potential blind spots. Harrison's points out 3 major traps, mostly driven by how highly specialized medicine has become. Trap number 1, missing the cardiac manifestations of a systemic illness, like forgetting that a whole-body disease like scleroderma can actually cause severe pulmonary hypertension. Trap 2 is the exact reverse, missing a systemic disorder that's causing the heart disease. For example, failing to realize that Lyme disease might be the hidden culprit behind a patient's unexplained heart block. And trap number 3, which is probably the most prevalent one today, the hubris of over-relying on advanced invasive medical technology at the expense of basic clinical skills.
This quote really strikes at the heart of that third pitfall. While invasive tests like a coronary arteriogram give doctors incredibly precise diagnostic info, they are meant to supplement, not supplant, a careful history and physical exam. You absolutely cannot just order an angiogram in lieu of taking a proper history from a patient with chest pain. Sure, the imaging might show blockages, but without the clinical context, the doctor won't know if those blockages are actually causing the patient's symptoms or if clearing them will even help the patient at all.
Which brings us to our final, pretty provocative thought. The text actually points out a gradual decline in physical examination skills over recent decades, noting that classic cardiac findings are recognized by only a minority of residents today. So we really have to ask, in an era of incredibly advanced medical technology, are we losing the time-honored art of the bedside physical exam? The best medical detectives know that high-tech imaging and lab tests are incredibly powerful tools, but they can never fully replace the life-saving balance of a brilliant clinical history, a careful stethoscope, and the trained, deductive mind of a physician.